So I'll delve right into the topic straight away. Mr. Femi had already touched partly on the root cause as regards forex issues and the issues we're having with in terms of generating export. So I'll just dive right into it so that we can see the presentation. Thank you very much.
Just to double check, you'll share from your end, right?
Yes, and
Great.
confirm if you can see my screen.
Not yet. Okay, I see you start sharing now. Great. We see your screen.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks.
you very much. So I'll be speaking of foreign exchange, foreign reserve exchange rates and non-oil exports. A very topical conversation. Over the past few months, it's been the most important conversation for everyone in the country, knowing how pivotal and how important it is to both our domestic living and in the businesses that we do. Forex is somehow tied to everything that we do, being an import economy. However, the conversation, being invited to an export platform, shows that yes, there are a group of people who understand the problem and are trying to solve the problem from a root cause analysis framework. Okay, so here we go. The state of play. What exactly is happening with the economy? Today we have our forest reserves at $33.5 billion, as stated by the CBN. NAFEX rate is 84 to $1. If you look at parallel rates, of course, it's around 1,140. Our crude oil is 1.3 million barrels per day, far below our capacity. We can see our inflation rate is 27.73%. Our non-oil exports is at 4.8 billion for 2002, and our budget deficit as of last year was 7 trillion. These figures point to a story. They tell us that there is a crisis brewing. For $33.3 billion gives us barely 7 months cover. However, as we go along the line, we see that this is just a gross reserve that tells just a part of the story. And policymakers are at a crossroad in trying to determine how to shape our current macroeconomic indices. Of course, the FX rate moving from 400 to 800, of course, it jumps to 1,000 at some point. It's a crisis level jump, which is way more than 200%. So as we go along the line, we see exactly our forest reserves. We see the trend. I did a 5-year trend to say from 2014 to 2023. We see the lows, we see the peak, and we can see that at the level that we are now, we are $33 billion from a high of $60 billion in 2008. That impacts our ability to meet our obligations, and then that also impacts how countries respond to both letters of credit, how banking, financial sector responds to letter of credit that emanates from Nigeria, especially for those who are into importation and export. So we see that this state of play shows a dire situation. Our foreign reserves are usually, for those who are not well versed, foreign reserves are assets that are held on reserve by a monetary authority. In our case, our CBN. These reserves are usually used to back liabilities and influence monetary policy. And they include all of the foreign banknotes, deposits, treasury bills, and foreign government security. We are reported to have the $3 billion gross reserves with a significant number encumbered. I put this footnote just to show something that happened sometime in August, a report that came out in August that showed that from the $33 billion that is assumed that we have in our gross reserves, FX forward at $6.8 billion, security lending already have $5.5 billion, and currency swaps were allegedly to have entered into currency swaps worth $21 billion. And so JP Morgan projects that our net foreign reserves is around $3.7 billion. What this state of play tells us is that a giant of Africa at $3.7 billion, we are vulnerable. And so foreign currency speculators begin to attack the currency and begin to speculate. And that's why we see the movement we have in our currency. This movement, you are going to see wide swings as a result of this state of play. However, the government has not folded its hands. Policymakers are trying to respond. And what has been the response so far? The response has been that they are going to we are moving towards a more flexible or market rate determined exchange rate system rather than the fixed exchange rate system that existed prior to now. In moving to that market rate system, it means that willing buyer, willing seller. So people bring their dollars into the market and quote the price that they want for their dollars. However, we have seen that within the NAFES platform, price stayed at 750 for so long, while in the power market, we saw wide swings. However, within the last few weeks, we've seen further movement in that space to ensure that currencies around, we've seen that space to be currencies around 834 naira. As at this morning was 844. Now on the NAFES rate. What we now notice, we notice now that there's a spring, a lot of speculation going on. A lot of people are holding back. A lot of people are front-loading demand just to ensure that they can get a lot of dollars that they need to trade within the period that they need it, and they don't have to resort to go back to the market. So we find that speculative motives are mixing with genuine demand that is yet being unmet. However, over the last few weeks also, there have been news that came into the market as to banks, CBN clearing FS backlogs. The FS backlogs are part of the $6 billion that you see here. They're clearing that in the market, and then there was some appreciation, which saw Naira appreciate a bit, and then the movement continued this week because all has not been cleared. The whole backlog is still not being cleared. I think about 90% for foreign banks, while local banks are yet to be cleared. So we still have a persisting situation where the foreign reserves are encumbered, and then Nigeria is looking for funds everywhere. So we move to, this is a chart that shows our FS supply and demand needs. Currently, what are we seeing in terms of demand? For FS supply, we are supposed to get oil. Of course, we get FS from oil sale proceeds, LNG, cash calls, other commodities, of course, which is export of agricultural commodities, diaspora remittances, and inflow. While for demand, we see tradable goods, payment for invisibles, which people who are education, foreign education, medical tourism, dividend repatriation, and swap arrangements. The state of play shows that our oil sales have declined significantly. We lose an average of 400,000 barrels a day to oil theft, and the government is continually fighting oil theft to ensure that that is recovered. However, as of today, we still have production at 1.3 million barrels from a high of 2 million barrels before COVID. And that has impacted on our forex ability to receive forex. Same thing for LNG. The managing director was quoted in the media to say they are operating at 58% capacity, meaning that if we're expecting forex from LNG, that forex level is dropping. Same thing for our cash calls. NNPC has been paying backlog of arrears over the past few years, I think close to $5 billion. And that has made them not to be able to, they are deducting directly from the money that was supposed to be paid into foreign federation accounts. And that has denied revenue to the government. For other commodity sales, we've seen an uptick in commodity sales that has come in the form of non-oil exports. We've seen an uptick in that numbers, but that is not significant enough to take Nigeria out of the doldrum. Last year, we did around $4 billion, which was reflected in the other chart. For diaspora remittances and investment flows, diaspora remittances dropped significantly last 2 years, just after COVID. And this year, we have seen that diaspora remittances have stopped flowing through the usual channels. We have seen a proliferation of peer-to-peer transfers. And so you have all manner of transfer scheme when you want to transfer dollars to Nigeria. And because it's not going through the official channels, CBN is unable to capture that. And then that is happening at the parallel markets, which is affecting supply of dollars to the market. This used to come directly into the banking system and used to account for supply in that system. So we see that on the supply side, just commodity sales are showing an uptick, but all the other elements are downward sloping, they are going down. For tradable goods, what do we trade? We bring in unique demand for dollars for wheat, corn, sugar, all of the things that we bring into the country, payment for invisibles, and repatriation for dividend, then swap arrangements. In all of this, those of the people who are in tradable goods feel from sometimes they get just a fraction of what they need for bringing in there. And so they have to source the rest from parallel market, which also impacts the demand as well in that space. And we see growth. Payment for invisible as well. We see the same pattern continues where they have to, the market cannot meet the I&E market cannot meet that requirement for them. And so they have to go on the outside. So we proceed to the next slide. For exchange rate, I spoke about this. So I'm just going to speak about it more extensively. I said that we're moving to a more, CBN has announced a more flexible exchange rate regime. Why is this in place? They do not have the firepower at the current rate of foreign reserves. I mentioned that foreign reserves was supposed to be used to support monetary policy and then to defend our currency. But at the level that we are in terms of policy, the CBN has said it's not in a position to defend the Naira. So we are moving to a more flexible exchange rate. and so as to enable the Naira to find its level. So they have adopted that as a policy. And today we can see that the Naira has moved from 400 in the trend. We can see that it has moved sharply into the 800 region. And we are seeing 839 as of this. We see that also that the government has made a key pronouncement that it's going to unify the rates, and it has made it a key objective that it will unify the rates. However, at different markets, we have seen that the divergence have continued. The parallel rate is at 1,140, and the NAFES rate is at 839. That is about, we are seeing a divergence of around over 30%. That tells us that that policy has still not taken root, and so Naira is still swinging widely. The settlement of FS forwards, like I mentioned earlier, the last few weeks, saw some appreciation for Naira within this zone, and then we are back as the market has been able to soak all that up. Like we said, some of these things are temporary. However, however much the temporary relief that we have, we must also begin to look at a much more sustainable intervention by the monetary authorities. However, that would require a combination of the fiscal space. The fiscal authorities complement what the monetary authorities are doing currently. For non-oil exports, I'm particularly very focused on this because this is supposed to be an export group. And then so we look at the figures. I put this graph here, which is called from FDC research. I just did a for crude oil. We see that these are major exports. However, gas also complements that. Then we now see cashew nuts, cocoa, sesame seeds, and soya beans. This shows our major crops, which is supposed to be our non-oil exports, alongside our major exports. There is no gainsaying that our major export is crude oil and bringing much more revenue. However, we see opportunities in this place. There are clear opportunities for export from this zone. So the conversation should be, how do we get this graph to begin to grow as this? To begin to grow as this? How do we begin to get this? So I did a further study, I did a further check on April-May CBN reports. This was a more recent for this year. It shows top 5 market share of non-oil exports. And Indorama Petrochemical had 11% of the share of non-oil exports within those periods. Indorama is a fertilizer, they export fertilizer mostly from their plant in Port Harcourt. And this is contributing to a bigger share of non-oil export. Outspan comes second in production in terms of non-oil exports. And we see that Outspan deals with, we notice that Outspan Limited deals with the metals. It also deals with aluminum. And we go to Segiola Resources. If you are paying attention to if you pay attention to events in the mining space, you know Segiola Resources. They are also into export of gold, export into mining. They're into mining and export of precious metals. So Segiola is doing 4.2% of that within that period. We see metal recycling, they recycle aluminum. We see them come in this space. Then we see Starlink Global. Sterling Global exports cashew and cocoa. And so these are the top within 2023 for April and May, called from CBN reports. Now, these are what I call, for the non-oil exports, I call them a defense mechanism because it gives you a much more stable income if we are able to develop it. Oil has a lot of swing because it is autonomously controlled. You have OPEC who's in charge of it, and then there are some things that are beyond our power. We get OPEC quota, we are limited in terms of that space, and so our best bet is to look at how we can improve our export from within Nigeria so that we don't have wide swings, and we have a base in terms of export income, which is more or less what we call diversification of export revenue.
I'm jumping in here to say I know your slides are quite rich. I'm very particular about slide 11 that says what must be done, so we can allow for a lot of interactions.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so we see I built a trend here. So we see a trend for 2019 for non-oil export figures. 2020, we see a high of almost $8 billion. We see a movement and a slowing down. Of course, COVID happened around here, and then we are trying to climb our way up. Right now, we are at this point. We're looking at, of course, and the NAPC is trying to see how we can scale up in terms of getting it to a high of at least $25 billion in 2025. Is that doable? Of course, nothing is impossible. It depends on the commitment of the stakeholders in here and in government. It depends also what the monetary policy authorities decide to do and what the fiscal authorities, as well as agents playing in the field, say. So my next slide, I can mention $2 billion in 2021, $4.8 billion in 2022, and a projection of 2025 to have $25 billion. It looks impossible from where we are, but there is nothing that is impossible if we commit our hearts to it. If we are 28, we live in 3 years, can we muster the ability to deliver $25 billion in terms of non-oil exports? The answer lies in what everyone who's responsible, all the stakeholders in the export industry, likes to do. And that will lead me into my next slide to say what should be done, what are the complications currently. We know that currently we have logistics constraints. What do I mean by logistics constraints? For exports, you have to aggregate first. You have to aggregate products at hinterland. And so there are people who do aggregation. That in terms of trying to get those products out from those hinterland, roads can be a challenge. Getting it to port cities becomes a challenge because of the bad roads, because of the inadequate connections, transport connections as well. Also, the delays at the port. We all know the challenge we have with port administration, and so those are part of logistics constraints. We have a fragmented value chain, which are part of things that I've mentioned before. A value chain that there's no proper link between processors, and then handshake between processors and then the farmers, and then there's no proper handshake in terms of proper refinement to the standard that is required from those who are going to use final end user. So we find that between the value chain, there's always a mismatch or misalignment which needs to be well covered and well taken care of if there has to be progress with our exports. Infrastructure, we cannot overemphasize the impact of infrastructure. Talking about train, talking about good roads. Currently, inland towards Edo State, somewhere around Kogi State, some roads, even coming out from Benue, which is a major food zone, you see that the roads are a problem, especially after rainy season like this. You find that there are lack of infrastructure to be able to take. You neither have cold vans, you neither have very critical infrastructure, storage equipment. Even if you have storage equipment, there's no power to be able to run that. Even if you have power, there's diesel. In terms of cost of diesel and cost of operations, you have all that mix. That could be a problem for small holders and small producers, people who are just coming in. And then we have the knowledge gap in terms of knowing technical know-how, to understand how to package things, to understand what exactly is the requirement, country requirements for nations where we desire to export to. And as such, qualities begin to do, we have a lot of returned goods back to the country. And this sort of tend to be discouraging for people who are involved in export business. So these are the complications that we see in terms of export. So I moved to incohesive cluster. There's always been the talk around having a group that helps you to engage governments. Because if you are properly clustered, it becomes easier to have a conversation with government. It becomes easier to assess intervention. But we found that export groups sometimes that do not present a common front, and then it becomes a problem in terms of who the government needs to engage with or how the advocacy needs to come across. It's also important to mention that I recognize the work of TATRIG and the advocacy that they play. These are more of such advocacy. We see recognition by both the lawmakers, governments at every level that needs to participate in this and sort of solve challenges that export groups are having, peculiar challenges. It could be in terms of the host, it could be in terms of roads, and it could be in terms of road, it could be in terms of lawmaking, legal issues, it could be in terms of fees and all that. So there are so many things that could be inhibition when you do not cluster yourself properly to be able to engage government.
Yes,
so
for sake of time, I wonder if you could, yes, for sake of time, I wonder if you could bring this to a close for now, and we get into the interactive session in a bit. So how would you like to call it a wrap in a minute or two?
Okay, so I'll just touch on one more slide. So before I call it, so I call it what must be done. So what must be done to ensure that all of the challenges that we have now for crude oil production, I mentioned that for our FX, we have a current challenge. If we can get FX, we can get crude oil production to 2 million barrels per day. This provides us with some stability, because as the economy is now, it's like a patient that needs urgent blood transfusion. And that's why you see the president going all around to just get at least maybe a minimum infusion of at least between $5 to $10 billion just to stabilize the market rate. Because without stabilizing, it's not easy for us to plan. So by next year, you need to be able to plan for the future to say how much is FS going to be in the next few months. But if you can't plan and you have these wide swings, it's going to affect, and that's why improved crude oil production by stopping the debt is important. Monetary policy realignment. We said that the monetary policy realignment to tame inflation, ensure that cash is sucked in, inflation is tamed, interest rate is increased so that the inflation is tamed. And then there's a realignment, there's transparency in the, I see, so you want to make you can ask your
Well,
question.
I think it will get into a hard debate right now. So I will let you close with this export-led growth, and then we take Madam Afi and we get into that interactive session, okay?
Okay. So the export-led growth. So this is where export comes in, which is the non-oil export. We can see that we have potentials in agri space. Beyond the agri space, I know that we have potentials with recycling. I know that we have potentials with the mineral, which is a metal space. We need to anchor our growth to all those and ensuring that there are targets in terms of export. Every encumbrances in terms of export corridors must be built so that people can export within maximum days, an institutional framework within the port administration to allow exports to flow very quickly. It's very important right now. So I think I'm just going to.
Yes. Let's take a pause on that right now. Thank you so much. You've raised a lot of very important issues. The biggest question for me is, in 3 years, how can we jump from 4.8 billion where we are right now to 25 billion US dollars in terms of non-oil exports? I see that a lot of